Human unrest is not an accident. It is the structure of our existence. Before the modern world learned to hide its anxiety behind noise and progress, Blaise Pascal had already exposed a truth most still refuse to face. Man is not simply weak, man is divided. We reach for the infinite while trapped inside the finite. We crave certainty while living inside doubt. This contradiction is not a flaw to fix. It is the condition we must confront. Pascal did not write to comfort. He wrote to strip illusion. He saw that human beings do not suffer merely because life is hard. They suffer because they cannot bear to see themselves clearly. So they scatter, they distract, they escape. But what exactly are we running from when we feel every silence? Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Yet comfort is not the goal here. Clarity is, and clarity demands confrontation. Today, in a world louder than ever, we are not less anxious. We are more fragmented. Technology did not solve our inner conflict. It refined our ability to avoid it. So the question returns, sharper than before. If distraction disappears, what remains of you? This is where Pascal begins, and this is where we must follow. On. We imagine infinity, yet we decay in time. This is not poetic tension. This is existential conflict. The mind stretches toward what it cannot possess. The body anchors us to what we cannot escape. And between these two poles, consciousness becomes a battlefield. We often misunderstand suffering as something external. We blame events, people, or fate. This is a mistake. Circumstances amplify suffering, but they do not create it. The deeper source lies in the mismatch between what we are and what we cannot stop wanting to be. We want permanence in a world that erases everything. We want certainty in a reality that offers none. We want meaning that does not collapse under doubt. And yet, every structure we build eventually cracks. This contradiction produces a constant unease, not always loud, not always visible, but always present. Even in moments of comfort, something remains unsettled. Why? Because no achievement can resolve the gap between the finite and the infinite within us. You can accumulate success, but you cannot silence the question beneath it. You can construct identity, but you cannot stabilize it permanently. You can distract yourself, but you cannot eliminate the tension. And so a question emerges, sharp and unavoidable. What exactly are you trying to complete that can never be completed? Pascal forces this confrontation without mercy. He strips away the illusion that humans can become self-sufficient. According to him, the unease we feel is not a defect to be cured. It is a signal, a sign that something within us exceeds the boundaries of our existence. But this excess does not empower us. It destabilizes us. Because we cannot fulfill what we sense, the second layer deepens the fracture. We are not only limited, we are aware of our limitation. This awareness transforms simple existence into existential suffering. An animal lives within its boundaries without conflict. A human recognizes those boundaries and resents them. We do not just die. We know we will die. We do not just lack control. We know we lack control. This knowledge corrodes any illusion of stability. Many try to escape this realization by redefining happiness as comfort. But comfort is not resolution. It is sedation. It reduces intensity without addressing truth. Pascal rejects this compromise. He argues that the human condition cannot be solved by minimizing pain. Because pain is not the problem is the structure that produces it. Here lies another misconception. People believe that inner conflict is a sign of weakness. In reality, it is the mark of consciousness itself. To feel divided is to perceive reality beyond illusion. The person who feels no contradiction is not at peace. They are asleep. The one who feels the tension is already closer to truth, even if that truth is unbearable. The modern world has not escaped this condition. It has only disguised it more effectively. Today, we have more tools, more knowledge, more distractions than any previous era. Yet the unease remains. In fact, it intensifies, because the more we expand external possibilities, the more we expose internal emptiness. Technology accelerates life, but it does not resolve meaning. It amplifies the gap. We scroll, consume, achieve, connect, but the underlying question persists. Why does nothing feel sufficient for long? Why does satisfaction decay so quickly? Why does silence become uncomfortable? These are not psychological anomalies. They are structural realities. The human being cannot rest because it cannot reconcile itself. Modernity promises solutions through optimization, better habits, better systems, better control. But control does not eliminate contradiction. It refines it. You become more efficient at navigating life, but you do not become whole. The deeper conflict remains untouched. You are still finite. You still desire infinity. And so we return inward, not to comfort, but to confrontation. The root of unease is not external chaos. It is internal division. The mind demands coherence. Reality refuses to provide it. This creates a tension that cannot be negotiated away. It must be faced. Inside this tension lies fear. Not the fear of specific events, but a more primitive anxiety. The fear of groundlessness. The fear that there is no stable foundation beneath existence. This fear is rarely articulated clearly. Instead, it manifests as restlessness, overthinking, avoidance. But its origin is precise. It comes from recognizing that nothing in life can fully secure us. And yet we resist acknowledging this. Why? Because to admit it would mean abandoning the illusion of control. It would mean accepting that we are not the masters of our existence. It would mean facing the possibility that meaning is not given, not guaranteed, not stable. Most people prefer distraction over this confrontation. Pascal identifies this avoidance as one of the defining behaviors of humanity. We do not run from suffering, we run from ourselves. Silence becomes unbearable because it reveals the contradiction we carry. Stillness becomes threatening because it removes distraction. And in that exposure, we are forced to see what we cannot resolve. Consider the figure of the restless thinker, not a specific person, but a type. Someone who cannot stop questioning, cannot settle into simple answers, cannot fully believe in comforting illusions. This figure represents the human condition in its rawest form. Through this figure, we see that the problem is not ignorance. It is awareness without resolution. This awareness produces a strange duality. On one hand, it elevates us. We can reflect, analyze, imagine, transcend immediate experience. On the other hand, it destabilizes us, because every insight reveals another layer of uncertainty. Knowledge does not end questioning, it multiplies it. And so the human being becomes suspended between two extremes, too aware to be at peace, too limited to achieve completion. This is the core of existential misery. Not pain alone, but the impossibility of resolving the condition that produces pain. At this point, another question cuts through. If this contradiction cannot be resolved, then how can one live without collapsing under it? Pascal does not offer comfort. He does not pretend that harmony is easily attainable. Instead, he forces a shift. The goal is not to eliminate the contradiction, but to recognize it fully, to stop escaping, to stop pretending, to see clearly the structure of existence without distortion. This clarity does not remove suffering, but it transforms it. Because once the illusion of resolution is abandoned, a different kind of honesty emerges. You no longer chase false completeness. You no longer expect life to satisfy what it cannot. You begin to see existence as it is, not as you wish it to be. From this perspective, misery is no longer merely negative. It becomes revelatory. It exposes the limits of the human condition. It reveals the impossibility of self-sufficiency. It forces a confrontation with the deepest questions of existence. And yet, this revelation is not gentle. It demands everything. It demands that you abandon comforting narratives. It demands that you face uncertainty without guarantee. It demands that you stand within contradiction without escape. Most will not accept this demand. They will return to distraction, to noise, to constructed meaning. Not because these solve anything, but because they provide temporary relief. But relief is not truth, and truth does not disappear simply because it is ignored. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. Human beings are defined not by their achievements, but by their contradiction. Not by their certainty, but by their tension. Not by their control, but by their limits. This is not a flaw to fix. It is the condition to understand. Pascal's insight cuts deeper than comfort allows. He does not offer a way out of the human condition. He reveals that there is no simple exit. What exists instead is a confrontation, a demand to see clearly what we are, without illusion, without escape. And once this vision is accepted, something irreversible happens. The illusions that once sustained us begin to dissolve. The distractions lose their power. The false sense of completeness collapses. What remains is not peace, but clarity. And in that moment, the human being stands exposed before itself, unable to hide, unable to resolve, unable to deny. That is where the real weight of existence begins. Chapter 2: The Mechanisms of Distraction and the Art of Escaping Oneself. Human beings do not avoid suffering by accident. They actively construct distractions to escape the truth of their own existence. We do not run because life is hard. We run because stillness reveals something far more unbearable. The real threat is not the world. It is the self that emerges when the noise disappears. Long before modern society invented endless streams of entertainment, Blaise Pascal had already uncovered this pattern with brutal clarity. When people still believed leisure was harmless and busyness was virtue, he saw something darker beneath it. He saw that distraction is not a luxury. It is a defense mechanism. It is the shield we raise against the weight of being conscious. The first truth cuts immediately. Human beings fear being alone with themselves more than they fear adversity. This is not exaggeration. Place a person in difficulty, and they will struggle. Place them in silence with nothing to do, and something deeper begins to surface. Restlessness, anxiety, a vague discomfort that cannot be explained by external conditions. Why does this happen? Because silence removes the escape routes. When there is nothing to focus on outside, the mind turns inward. And what it finds is not peace. It finds contradiction, uncertainty, unresolved questions. It finds the same fracture Pascal described, now fully exposed. Distraction exists to prevent this encounter. We often misunderstand entertainment as pleasure. This is a mistake. Its deeper function is avoidance. It fills the space where confrontation would occur. It gives the mind something to hold on to so it does not fall into itself. This is why people reach for noise, even when they claim to seek rest. True rest would require facing the self. Most are not prepared for that. A question must be asked without softness. When was the last time you sat in complete stillness without reaching for anything to escape? The second layer reveals something more unsettling. Busyness is not always a sign of purpose. Often, it is a strategy of evasion. People do not only distract themselves with pleasure, they distract themselves with productivity. Work becomes a refuge. Schedules become armor. Constant activity becomes a way to avoid the deeper confrontation that stillness would force. This creates a powerful illusion. A busy life appears meaningful. It appears structured, directed, justified. But beneath this surface, the same avoidance operates. The individual is not necessarily living more fully. They are simply moving faster, leaving no space for reflection. Motion replaces meaning. Pascal dismantles the common belief that activity equals fulfillment. He argues that many pursuits are not chosen for their intrinsic value, but for their capacity to occupy attention. The goal is not always achievement. The goal is to not feel the void. This is why even after success, people do not stop. They continue. Not because they have found meaning, but because stopping would expose its absence. Here lies a crucial misunderstanding. People think they are searching for happiness. In reality, they are often searching for escape. Happiness implies fulfillment. Escape only requires distraction. These are not the same. One confronts reality, the other avoids it. The modern world intensifies this condition beyond anything Pascal could have directly witnessed, yet perfectly predicted. In 2025, distraction has become continuous. There is no longer a natural limit. Devices, platforms, constant information flows ensure that silence can be eliminated almost entirely. The external world has been engineered to prevent inward confrontation. But this does not solve the problem. It deepens it. Because the more we avoid ourselves, the more unfamiliar we become with what we are avoiding. The inner world becomes foreign, unstable, threatening, and so the need for distraction increases. It becomes not a choice, but a dependency. Notice the pattern. The moment boredom appears, the hand reaches for stimulation. The moment discomfort arises, attention is redirected. The moment silence deepens, noise is introduced. This is not random behavior. It is systematic avoidance, a conditioned response to the fear of self-confrontation. The third layer moves deeper into the psychological core. Distraction does not only protect us from discomfort, it protects us from truth. Because within the self lie questions that have no easy answers. Questions about meaning, purpose, mortality, identity. These are not abstract concerns. They are existential pressures. When these questions surface, they destabilize the individual. They strip away assumptions. They reveal uncertainty where certainty was expected. This is why distraction is so powerful. It postpones these questions indefinitely. It allows life to continue without resolution. But postponement is not elimination. The questions remain. They accumulate. And over time, the gap between lived experience and unexamined truth widens. This creates a subtle but persistent tension, a sense that something is off, even if it cannot be clearly articulated. Another question must be faced. Are you living your life, or are you filling it to avoid asking why you are living at all? Pascal's insight becomes sharper here. He does not accuse humans of weakness. He exposes a structural tendency. Consciousness produces discomfort. Distraction reduces it. Therefore, distraction becomes inevitable. But inevitability does not equal necessity. The fact that we tend to escape does not mean we must. Yet most people never break this cycle. Why? Because the cost of confrontation is high. To face oneself is to encounter uncertainty without immediate resolution. It is to stand without distraction and allow questions to remain unanswered. This requires a level of honesty that most avoid. Instead, people construct identities around their distractions. They define themselves by their roles, achievements, routines. These become substitutes for deeper understanding. They provide a sense of stability, even if it is fragile. As long as the activity continues, the illusion holds. But when the activity stops, even briefly, the underlying instability returns. This is why rest often feels uncomfortable. Not because rest is inherently unpleasant, but because it removes the distractions that maintain psychological balance. Without them, the self becomes visible again. Consider the figure of the constantly occupied individual, always working, always planning, always engaged. From the outside, this person appears driven, disciplined, successful. But internally, something else may be operating. A refusal to stop, a fear of what stopping would reveal. Through this figure, we see that distraction is not always passive. It can be highly active, even productive, but its function remains the same: to prevent confrontation with the deeper layers of existence. The modern condition amplifies this through social structures. Constant connectivity ensures that there is always something to respond to, something to consume, something to do. The individual is rarely left alone with their thoughts, and when they are, the discomfort feels unnatural, almost threatening. This leads to a paradox. We have more freedom than ever to explore ourselves, yet we avoid it more effectively than ever before. The tools for distraction have become so refined that they no longer feel like avoidance. They feel like normal life. But normal does not mean true. At the existential level, this avoidance has consequences. A life filled with distraction may appear full, but it lacks depth. It moves, but it does not necessarily understand where or why. It accumulates experiences, but does not integrate them. It reacts, but does not reflect. This creates a hollow form of existence, not empty in activity, but empty in meaning. The individual becomes a participant in life without becoming aware of life itself. They exist, but they do not fully confront existence. And so the central tension returns. The more we escape ourselves, the less we understand ourselves. The less we understand ourselves, the more we need to escape. This cycle reinforces itself until distraction becomes the default mode of being. Breaking this cycle requires something radical, not external change, but internal confrontation. It requires the willingness to remove distraction, even briefly, and face what emerges. Not to solve it immediately, but to see it clearly. This is where Pascal's philosophy becomes demanding. He does not offer techniques for comfort. He demands honesty. He demands that we recognize how deeply we are invested in avoiding ourselves. He demands that we question the structures we rely on to feel stable. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. Distraction is not a minor habit. It is a fundamental strategy of existence. It shapes how we live, how we think, how we relate to ourselves. It provides temporary relief, but at the cost of deeper understanding. To see this clearly is already to disrupt it. Because once the mechanism is exposed, it cannot function in the same unconscious way. The next time distraction appears, it is no longer neutral. It becomes visible as a choice, a movement away from confrontation. And in that moment, another possibility opens. Not comfort, but clarity. Not escape, but awareness. A space where the self is no longer avoided, but faced. Most will turn away from this space. It is too demanding, too uncertain, too unstable. But for those who remain, something shifts. The need for constant distraction begins to weaken, not because life becomes easier, but because truth becomes more important than comfort. And at that point, the illusion breaks, because you no longer escape yourself without knowing exactly what you are running from. Chapter 3: The Fracture Between Geometric Reason and Subtle Intuition. Truth is not always accessible through logic, and the human being collapses when it believes that reason alone is enough. We are taught to trust clarity, to rely on proof, to demand structure. Yet beneath this confidence lies a silent failure. Not everything that is real can be demonstrated. Not everything that matters can be measured. Long before modern rationalism crowned logic as the supreme authority, Blaise Pascal had already drawn a sharp line within human understanding. When the world was intoxicated with the power of mathematics and scientific reasoning, he saw a limit that others refused to admit. He did not reject reason, he exposed its boundary. He revealed that there are two distinct ways of knowing, and confusing them leads to blindness. The first movement begins with a clear statement. Geometric reason seeks precision, order, and demonstrable truth. It operates through definitions, proofs, and structured arguments. It builds systems where each conclusion follows necessarily from what came before. This form of thinking is powerful. It allows us to construct science, to predict outcomes, to control aspects of the physical world. But its strength is also its limitation. It only functions where clarity can be established. It requires stable premises, defined terms, and measurable relations. Outside of these conditions, it weakens. It becomes uncertain. And yet humans often attempt to apply this type of reasoning to areas where it cannot operate. This creates a critical error. People demand logical proof for experiences that are not structured logically. They seek certainty where only perception is possible. They attempt to reduce the complexity of existence into formulas that cannot contain it. And when logic fails to deliver absolute answers, they either deny reality or fall into confusion. Pascal identifies another mode of understanding that operates differently. He calls it a form of subtle intuition, not vague emotion, not irrational impulse, but a direct perception of truth that cannot be fully articulated. This form of knowing does not proceed step by step. It grasps wholes. It recognizes patterns instantly. It senses coherence without needing to prove it. This creates tension, because intuition cannot justify itself in the language of logic. It knows, but it cannot always explain how it knows. And for a mind trained to trust only what can be demonstrated, this becomes unacceptable. Here lies the second fracture. Humans do not only misunderstand the limits of reason, they distrust the legitimacy of intuition. They treat it as inferior, unreliable, subjective. But Pascal argues that this is a mistake. There are truths that can only be accessed through this subtle perception. To reject it is to cut oneself off from an entire dimension of reality. A question must be faced without retreat. How many of your deepest convictions can actually be proven logically? The answer exposes something uncomfortable. Very few. Most of what guides human life operates beyond strict reasoning. Trust, love, moral judgment, aesthetic appreciation, even the sense of meaning itself. These are not derived from equations. They are recognized inwardly, often without clear explanation. Yet modern thinking, especially intensified in 2025, continues to elevate logic as the ultimate authority. Data, analysis, measurable outcomes dominate decision-making. This creates an illusion of control and certainty. But beneath this surface, something essential is lost: the capacity to perceive what cannot be quantified. This does not mean that intuition replaces reason. Pascal does not propose chaos over structure. He proposes distinction. Each form of understanding has its domain. Reason excels in the measurable. Intuition operates in the immeasurable. Wisdom lies in knowing where each applies. The third movement sharpens the conflict further. When humans confuse these domains, they distort reality. They either overextend reason or overtrust intuition. Both lead to error. Overextension of reason leads to reduction. Everything is forced into frameworks that simplify but also strip depth. Complex human experiences are reduced to mechanisms. Meaning is treated as a problem to solve rather than a reality to encounter. This creates a sterile form of understanding, accurate in detail, empty in significance. On the other hand, ungrounded intuition leads to illusion. Without any structure, perception becomes unstable. It drifts, influenced by bias, emotion, projection. What feels true is mistaken for what is true. This creates confusion disguised as insight. Pascal's position is not comfortable. He demands balance but not compromise. He insists that both forms of knowing must be respected but never confused. Each must remain within its limits. This leads to a deeper realization. Human beings do not fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they misapply it. They use the wrong tool for the wrong domain. They seek proof where perception is required and trust feeling where structure is necessary. The modern world amplifies this misalignment. With the rise of artificial systems, algorithmic thinking, and data-driven environments, geometric reason has expanded its influence dramatically. It shapes decisions, systems, and even personal identities. People begin to see themselves through metrics, outputs, measurable success. But this expansion creates a subtle loss. The more we rely on structured reasoning, the less we trust unstructured insight. The more we quantify, the less we perceive. The more we analyze, the less we understand. Another question emerges, sharper than before. Are you living according to what can be measured or according to what can be understood? This question reveals a fracture within the self, because what can be measured is often external, visible, comparable. What can be understood is internal, invisible, singular. When the first dominates, the second weakens, and with it, the depth of existence diminishes. At the psychological level, this creates a quiet conflict. Individuals begin to doubt their own perceptions. They seek external validation for internal truths. They hesitate to trust what they feel unless it can be justified logically. This leads to disconnection from one's own experience. Pascal sees this as a fundamental error. The heart, in his view, has reasons that reason cannot fully comprehend. This is not a rejection of rationality. It is a recognition that human understanding exceeds rational structure. To ignore this is to fragment oneself. One part of the mind demands proof. Another part perceives without it. When these parts are in conflict, the individual becomes unstable. They either suppress intuition or abandon reason. Both parts lead away from clarity. Consider the figure of the purely rational thinker. Everything must be justified, explained, proven. Nothing is accepted without evidence. This person appears rigorous, disciplined, precise. But something is missing. A certain sensitivity, a certain openness to what cannot be reduced. Through this figure, we see the cost of over-reliance on reason. the world becomes narrower. Only what fits within logical structure is considered real. Everything else is dismissed. This creates a form of blindness, not from lack of intelligence, but from excess of rigidity. Now consider the opposite figure, the one who trusts feeling above all. Decisions are made based on inner sense, without verification. This person may appear intuitive, connected, fluid, but without grounding, perception becomes unreliable. Illusion and truth blend. Through this figure, we see the danger of unstructured intuition. Without the discipline of reason, insight loses its anchor. It becomes subjective, unstable. Pascal forces a confrontation between these extremes. He does not allow escape into either side. He demands integration, but not fusion. Each must remain distinct, yet both must be acknowledged. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. Human understanding is dual. It operates through both structure and perception. Denying either is a form of self-limitation. Overextending either is a form of distortion. To live wisely is not to choose between reason and intuition. It is to recognize their boundaries with precision. It is to know when to demand proof and when to accept perception. It is to stand within the tension without collapsing into one side. This is not easy. It requires constant awareness. It requires the humility to admit that not everything can be known in the same way. It requires the discipline to avoid the comfort of oversimplification. And most importantly, it requires honesty. Because the temptation to reduce complexity is always present. The mind seeks certainty. It prefers clear answers. But reality does not always provide them. Pascal's insight cuts through this desire. He reveals that uncertainty is not a failure of understanding. It is a condition of existence. To demand absolute clarity in all things is to misunderstand the nature of reality itself. And so the final confrontation emerges. You cannot fully prove what you must still live by. You cannot fully explain what you must still trust. You cannot reduce existence to a system without losing what makes it meaningful. At that point, the illusion of total understanding collapses, and you are left standing between what can be known and what must be accepted without proof, unable to escape either side. Chapter 4. The Self as the Most Elusive Illusion. The self is not what we think it is, and the more we try to grasp it, the more it slips into distortion. We assume we know who we are. We speak in certainty. We construct identity as if it were stable. Yet beneath this confidence lies a deeper truth. The self is not a fixed entity. It is a shifting construction, constantly revealing and concealing itself at the same time. Long before modern psychology dissected identity and self-deception, Blaise Pascal had already exposed the instability at the center of the human ego. When the world believed that self-knowledge could be achieved through reflection and introspection alone, he saw something more unsettling. He saw that the self does not simply hide from others. It hides from itself. The first movement must be faced without illusion. Human beings do not see themselves as they are. They see themselves as they want to be. This is not a minor bias. It is a structural distortion. Every act of self-perception is filtered through desire, fear, and defense. We do not observe ourselves objectively. We interpret ourselves in ways that protect our internal stability. This creates a dangerous illusion, the belief that self-awareness is easily attainable. In reality, what most people call self-knowledge is a curated image, a version of the self that has been edited, simplified, and justified. The parts that threaten this image are suppressed, rationalized, or ignored. We do not lie to others as effectively as we lie to ourselves. A question cuts through this illusion with precision. If you were stripped of every narrative you tell about yourself, what would remain? The discomfort of this question reveals the depth of the problem. Because identity is not just something we have, it is something we maintain. It requires constant reinforcement through memory, through comparison, through validation. Without this reinforcement, the sense of self begins to destabilize. The second layer exposes a deeper contradiction. The self is not only hidden, it is divided. There is no single unified identity within us. There are multiple tendencies, impulses, perspectives that do not fully align. One part desires recognition, another seeks withdrawal. One part pursues truth, another avoids it. These are not temporary conflicts, they are permanent structures. Yet, we present ourselves as coherent. Why? Because coherence is easier to live with than fragmentation. To admit internal division would mean accepting instability, and instability threatens control. So we construct a simplified version of ourselves, a narrative that unifies contradictions into a single story. This story becomes our identity, but it is not the full truth. It is a reduction. Pascal reveals that this reduction is necessary, but also deceptive. Necessary because without it, the self would feel chaotic. Deceptive because it hides the deeper complexity of human existence. Here lies another misunderstanding. People believe that knowing oneself means accumulating more information about oneself, more reflection, more analysis, more introspection. But this often leads to reinforcement, not revelation. The self studies itself through the same filters that distort it. True self-knowledge requires something else, not more observation, but less defense. This introduces a third movement. The self is protected by mechanisms that operate automatically. Justification, denial, projection. These are not conscious strategies. They are embedded responses. When something threatens the image we hold of ourselves, these mechanisms activate. They reshape perception to preserve stability. This is why confronting oneself is so difficult. It is not simply about willingness. It is about overcoming structures designed to prevent that confrontation. The mind resists exposure. It deflects, reinterprets, softens. It ensures that the self remains intact, even at the cost of truth. Another question emerges, sharper than before. Are you seeking to understand yourself or to protect the version of yourself you prefer? Most people never ask this question seriously, because to ask it is to risk destabilization. It is to admit that what you believe about yourself may not be accurate, that your motivations may be less pure, your intentions less clear, your identity less solid. The modern world intensifies this distortion. In 2025, identity is no longer only internal. It is externalized, displayed, curated through constant interaction. People construct versions of themselves not only for self-understanding, but for presentation. This amplifies the gap between what is lived and what is shown. The self becomes a performance. But performance requires consistency. It requires maintaining an image across time and context. This creates pressure, because the internal reality does not always match the external projection. The more one invests in the image, the harder it becomes to confront the discrepancy. This leads to a subtle fragmentation. The individual begins to live in layers. One layer is presented, another is experienced. These layers do not fully align, and the tension between them grows. Pascal's insight becomes even more relevant here. The self is not only difficult to know, it is actively involved in its own concealment. It participates in the illusion that defines it. At the psychological level, this creates a constant instability, because the self cannot fully trust itself. There is always a suspicion, often unconscious, that something is being hidden. This produces anxiety, not always intense, but persistent. People attempt to resolve this by strengthening identity, by becoming more defined, more certain, more consistent. But this does not solve the problem. It deepens it. Because the stronger the image, the more must be hidden to maintain it. This creates a paradox. The more you try to solidify who you are, the more you distance yourself from what you are. Consider the figure of the self-assured individual, confident, consistent, certain. This person appears stable, grounded, clear. But beneath this certainty, something else may operate. A refusal to question, a resistance to ambiguity, a need to maintain control over identity. Through this figure, we see the cost of rigid self-construction. The self becomes fixed, but also limited. It loses flexibility, openness, the capacity to evolve. It becomes an object, not a living process. Now consider the opposite figure, the one who constantly questions, constantly doubts, never settles into a stable identity. This person appears reflective, open, searching, but without any structure, identity dissolves into uncertainty. There is no anchor, no coherence. Through this figure, we see the danger of total fluidity. Without some form of structure, the self cannot function. It becomes unstable, fragmented. Pascal does not allow escape into either extreme. He forces the recognition that the self must exist between these poles, structured but not rigid, fluid but not chaotic, known but never fully. This leads to a deeper realization. The self is not something to be fully captured. It is something to be continuously confronted, not as an object to define, but as a process to observe without illusion. This confrontation requires a specific kind of honesty, not the honesty of declaring truths, but the honesty of allowing uncomfortable perceptions to remain, to see contradiction without resolving it immediately, to notice defense without justifying it. This is not a comfortable process. It destabilizes the image we rely on. It reveals inconsistencies. It exposes motivations we prefer to ignore. But it also brings something else, a different kind of clarity. Not clarity as certainty, but clarity as awareness. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. The self is not a stable entity to be discovered once and for all. It is a dynamic structure shaped by perception, defense, and contradiction. To believe otherwise is to fall into illusion. Self-knowledge, then, is not accumulation, it is reduction. Not adding more layers, but stripping away distortions. Not constructing identity, but exposing its mechanisms. This does not lead to complete understanding. That remains impossible. The self cannot fully step outside itself to observe itself completely. There will always be blind spots, distortions, unknowns. But something shifts when this is accepted. The need for certainty weakens. The attachment to fixed identity loosens. The fear of contradiction diminishes. And in that space, a more honest relationship with oneself becomes possible. Not a perfect understanding, not a stable definition, but a continuous confrontation with what is, without the need to immediately reshape it into something more comfortable. Most will avoid this path. It offers no easy answers, no stable identity, no comforting narrative. It demands constant awareness, constant questioning, constant exposure. But for those who do not turn away, the illusion begins to crack. And in that fracture, the self is no longer something you believe in, but something you can no longer hide from. Chapter 5: The Wager of Existence and the Impossibility of Neutrality. You are already choosing, even when you claim you are not. There is no neutral position in existence. There is no place outside the game where you can observe without participating. To live is to commit. To delay is still to decide. And every decision, whether conscious or avoided, shapes the direction of your life. Long before modern decision theory attempted to formalize uncertainty and risk, Blaise Pascal had already exposed a deeper structure beneath human choice. When the world believed that one could suspend judgment indefinitely, he saw something more radical. He saw that suspension itself is a form of commitment, that refusing to choose is not an escape from consequence, but a hidden submission to it. The first movement must be faced without illusion. There are questions in life that cannot be ignored without cost, not because they demand immediate answers, but because they define the ground on which all other answers stand. Questions about meaning, purpose, belief, direction, these are not optional. They are unavoidable. Yet most people attempt to avoid them. They postpone, they defer. They tell themselves that clarity will come later, that certainty must be reached before commitment. But this is a misunderstanding. Life does not wait for certainty. It moves. And in that movement, you are already positioned by the assumptions you have chosen, whether consciously or not. This leads to a sharp realization. You are living according to a framework of belief, even if you have never examined it. You act, decide, prioritize, all based on underlying assumptions about what matters, what is real, what is worth pursuing. These assumptions form the invisible structure of your life. A question emerges, direct and unavoidable. What are you betting your life on, right now, without admitting that it is a bet? The second movement deepens the tension. Pascal's wager is often misunderstood as a simple argument about belief in God. This is a reduction. Its deeper meaning lies elsewhere. It reveals that human existence operates under conditions of uncertainty where action cannot be postponed. You do not possess complete knowledge. You cannot access absolute proof for the most important questions. And yet, you must still live. You must still act. This creates a situation where every choice becomes a wager, not a gamble in the sense of randomness, but a commitment made under incomplete information. This is the structure of existence itself. People often believe that belief should follow certainty, that one must first know, then commit. Pascal reverses this. He shows that in many cases, commitment precedes certainty. You live as if something is true before you can prove that it is. And through living, that assumption shapes your reality. This is where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. Many claim neutrality. They say they neither believe nor reject. They position themselves as observers, waiting for sufficient evidence. But Pascal dismantles this stance completely. There is no observer outside life. To not choose is to choose a path of delay, of non-commitment, of passive acceptance of whatever unfolds. This is not neutral. It is a specific orientation toward existence. It carries consequences, just like any other decision. The illusion of neutrality is one of the most powerful forms of self-deception because it allows individuals to avoid responsibility while still being shaped by their choices. It creates the sense of distance without actual distance. The third movement exposes the existential weight of this structure. Every life is built on assumptions that cannot be fully justified. Whether you believe in meaning or reject it, whether you trust in purpose or deny it, whether you commit to something beyond yourself or remain within yourself, each position is a wager. And the stakes are not abstract, they are lived. Your time, your energy, your direction, your identity, all are invested according to what you assume to be true. If your assumptions are false, the cost is not theoretical, it is existential. It is your life itself. This leads to another sharp question. If you are wrong about what you are living for, what exactly are you losing? Most people avoid this question because to face it is to recognize the risk embedded in every choice. It is to admit that there is no safe path, that every direction involves uncertainty, that every commitment exposes you to the possibility of error. But avoiding the question does not remove the risk. It only makes it unconscious. The modern world intensifies this illusion of safety. In 2025, systems are designed to minimize visible risk. Predictive models, data analysis, structured planning, these create the impression that uncertainty can be controlled, reduced, managed. But this control operates only on the surface. At the deeper level of existence, uncertainty remains absolute. No system can answer the question of meaning definitively. No model can eliminate the need for personal commitment. No structure can remove the necessity of choosing how to live. And yet, people continue to behave as if they can delay these decisions indefinitely. They invest in temporary goals, short-term outcomes, measurable success, not because these are ultimately sufficient, but because they provide a way to avoid confronting the larger wager. This avoidance creates a fragmented life. One part operates in daily decisions. Another part remains unexamined, undefined. The connection between them is weak. Actions are taken without fully understanding the assumptions behind them. Pascal forces the integration of these layers. He demands that the individual recognize the unity of existence, that every action reflects a deeper commitment, whether acknowledged or not. Consider the figure of the rational skeptic. This person refuses to commit without proof. They demand evidence. clarity, certainty. They reject belief systems that cannot be logically justified. This appears intellectually honest, but Pascal exposes the hidden assumption. The skeptic is already living according to a belief. The belief that withholding commitment is the correct approach. That skepticism itself is a valid stance. Through this figure, we see that even rejection is a form of acceptance. It accepts a framework where certainty is required before commitment. And this framework itself cannot be proven absolutely. It is also a wager. Now consider the opposite figure, the one who commits fully to a belief without questioning. This person appears decisive, grounded, certain. But without examination, commitment becomes blind. It ignores the possibility of error. It closes itself to correction. Through this figure, we see the danger of unexamined belief. It provides stability, but at the cost of awareness. Pascal does not allow escape into either position. He forces the recognition that both involve risk, both involve commitment, both are wagers. The difference lies in awareness. To live without recognizing the wager is to be carried by assumptions you have not chosen consciously. To live with awareness is to accept the risk, to acknowledge the uncertainty, and to still commit. This requires a specific form of courage. Not the courage to be certain, but the courage to act without certainty. To choose knowing that you do not fully know. To invest your life in something that cannot be proven completely. This is not irrational, it is existentially necessary. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. Human life is structured as a wager, not because we choose it to be so, but because we are placed in a condition where knowledge is incomplete and action is unavoidable. You cannot step outside this structure. You cannot refuse to play. Even refusal is participation. And so the question is no longer whether you will wager. The question is how consciously you will do it. Will you drift, guided by unexamined assumptions, reacting to circumstances without clear direction? Or will you confront the uncertainty directly, choose your position, and accept the consequences? There is no safe answer. There is no guaranteed outcome. There is only the reality that your life is already invested in something, and at that moment, the illusion collapses completely, because you realize that every second you live is already a commitment you never truly escaped. Chapter 6: The Hierarchy of Realities and the Distortion of Value. Not all values belong to the same order, and confusion begins the moment we measure everything by a single standard. Human beings do not only misjudge the world, they misjudge the structure of reality itself. They place what is lower above what is higher, and in doing so, they distort both their lives and their societies. Long before modern systems attempted to flatten value into metrics, productivity, and utility, Blaise Pascal had already identified a deeper architecture within existence. When the world still believed that strength, intelligence, and virtue could be compared directly, he saw a separation that cannot be crossed. He saw that reality is divided into distinct orders, each governed by its own logic, each incomparable to the others. The first movement must be confronted without confusion. The physical order operates through force, presence, and material power. It is the domain of the body, of strength, of visible impact. In this order, superiority is measurable. One body is stronger than another. One force dominates another. The logic is clear, direct, undeniable. But this clarity creates an illusion. Because what is measurable appears more real. What can be seen, quantified, and demonstrated takes precedence in perception. And so, people begin to believe that power in this order defines value itself. This is the first distortion. The second order emerges above it, the intellectual. Here, force loses its authority. Physical strength cannot produce understanding. A powerful body cannot generate truth. In this domain, superiority is not measured by force, but by clarity, insight, coherence. A single idea can outweigh immense physical power. Yet this order introduces its own illusion. Because intelligence can explain, analyze, and construct systems, it begins to assume dominance over all forms of value. It reduces reality into what can be understood, categorized, and articulated. It treats knowledge as the highest measure. This is the second distortion. The third order stands apart, and this is where Pascal's insight becomes most unsettling. The order of charity, of love, of moral depth. Here, neither force nor intellect has authority. Strength cannot produce compassion. Intelligence cannot guarantee goodness. This domain operates through a different logic entirely. It cannot be measured. It cannot be proven in the same way. It reveals itself through transformation, through orientation toward others, through a movement beyond the self. And yet, this order is the least recognized. A question cuts sharply through all illusions. By what standard are you measuring your life? Most people do not ask this. They assume a single scale. They compare strength, intelligence, success, influence, as if all belong to the same dimension. But this assumption collapses under scrutiny, because what belongs to one order cannot define another. A physically powerful individual may be intellectually limited. An intellectually brilliant person may be morally shallow. A morally profound individual may possess neither strength nor intellectual dominance. These are not contradictions, they are distinctions. Pascal demands that these distinctions be respected. The second movement deepens the analysis. The confusion of orders does not remain theoretical. It shapes behavior, identity, and society. When physical power is mistaken for ultimate value, domination becomes the goal. When intellectual ability is mistaken for ultimate value, arrogance emerges. When moral depth is ignored, everything becomes instrumental. This creates a hierarchy that is inverted. What should be higher is treated as lower. What should be distinct is treated as comparable. And in this distortion, human life loses its orientation. The modern world intensifies this inversion. In 2025, value is increasingly quantified. Success is measured through visible output, measurable achievements, external recognition. Even intelligence is reduced to performance, to data processing, to efficiency. The order of charity is almost invisible, not because it does not exist, but because it cannot be easily displayed, compared, or monetized. It does not produce immediate results. It does not fit into systems of measurement, and so it is overlooked. But its absence has consequences. Without this higher order, the lower orders expand without limit. Physical power seeks domination. Intellectual power seeks control. Both operate without orientation. They become self-serving, disconnected from any deeper purpose. This leads to a fragmented existence. Individuals become highly developed in one dimension while remaining underdeveloped in others. Strength without understanding. Understanding without compassion. Each isolated, each incomplete. Another question must be faced. What happens when a human being develops power without moral depth? The answer is not abstract. It is visible everywhere. Power becomes manipulation. Intelligence becomes justification. Systems become efficient but not meaningful. Life becomes structured but not directed. Pascal's insight exposes the root of this imbalance. The orders of reality are not meant to compete. They are meant to coexist, each within its domain. The problem arises when one attempts to dominate the others. The third movement pushes further into the psychological dimension. Individuals internalize this confusion. They begin to define themselves according to the wrong standards. They seek validation in domains that do not correspond to their deeper needs. A person may pursue intellectual recognition while neglecting emotional depth. Another may pursue physical dominance while ignoring reflection. Each path creates a partial identity, disconnected from the full structure of being. This produces a subtle dissatisfaction because no single order can fulfill the entirety of human existence. Each addresses only a part. When one is elevated above all others, the rest remain unfulfilled. This is why achievement often feels incomplete, why success does not resolve inner tension, why recognition does not eliminate emptiness. Because what is being fulfilled belongs to one order, while the deeper dimensions remain untouched. Pascal forces the confrontation. He reveals that human beings are not simple entities operating within a single dimension. They are layered, structured across different orders that cannot be reduced to one another. To ignore this is to live in distortion. Consider the figure of the dominant leader, physically commanding, socially powerful, influential. This person operates within the first order with mastery, but without intellectual clarity or moral depth, this power becomes unstable. It lacks direction. It imposes but does not understand. Through this figure, we see the limitation of force. Now consider the figure of the intellectual authority. Brilliant, analytical, capable of constructing complex systems of thought. This person operates within the second order with precision. But without moral orientation, this intelligence becomes detached. It explains, but does not guide. Through this figure, we see the limitation of intellect. Now consider the rare figure who embodies the third order, not defined by power or brilliance, but by a depth of presence, a capacity for genuine care, a movement beyond self-interest. This figure may not dominate externally, but it transforms internally and relationally. Through this figure, we see a different kind of superiority, one that cannot be imposed, only recognized. Pascal does not romanticize this. He does not claim that the higher order eliminates the lower. The body remains, the mind remains, but their roles are redefined. They are no longer ultimate. They are placed within a larger structure. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. Reality is not flat. It is hierarchical. But this hierarchy is not based on domination. It is based on transcendence. Each higher order does not destroy the lower. It reorients it. Strength becomes guided rather than uncontrolled. Intelligence becomes directed rather than self-serving. Both become integrated into a broader movement. This integration is rare. Because it requires recognition of limits, it requires the acceptance that power and intelligence are not sufficient. It requires the humility to admit that what is highest cannot be forced or fully understood. Most resist this. They remain within the lower orders where control is possible, where measurement is clear, where comparison is easy. But something remains unresolved, because the deeper dimension continues to call, even if it is ignored. And at some point, the inadequacy of the lower orders becomes undeniable. Power fails to satisfy. Intelligence fails to resolve. Achievement fails to complete. And in that moment, the structure of reality reveals itself without distortion. Not everything can be measured by the same scale, and everything collapses when you try. Chapter 7: The Hiddenness of God and the Tragedy of Belief. God is not absent. God is hidden. And this hiddenness is the condition that forces human freedom into existence. The silence is not emptiness. It is a demand that no one can escape, because it refuses to impose itself while refusing to disappear. Long before modern skepticism declared the death of transcendence, Blaise Pascal had already confronted a more disturbing reality. When the world expected divine presence to be obvious, undeniable, overwhelming, he saw the opposite. He saw a God who does not reveal himself completely, a God who remains veiled, not to deny himself, but to expose the human condition. The first movement must be faced without illusion. If God were fully evident, freedom would collapse. Belief would not be a choice. It would be a reaction. Compulsion would replace commitment. There would be no space for doubt, no space for decision, no space for genuine orientation. This is why hiddenness exists, not as a flaw, but as a structure, not as absence, but as restraint. The divine does not impose itself, because imposition destroys the possibility of authentic response. What is forced cannot be chosen. What is undeniable cannot be believed. It can only be acknowledged. This leads to a sharp question. If certainty were absolute, would your belief still have meaning? The answer reveals the paradox. True belief requires uncertainty. It requires the possibility of refusal. Without that possibility, belief loses its depth. It becomes automatic, empty, without weight. The second movement deepens the tension. Human beings interpret hiddenness as absence. They demand clarity, visibility, proof. When these are not given, they conclude that nothing is there. But this conclusion reveals more about human expectation than about reality. Pascal dismantles this expectation. He argues that the demand for absolute evidence is not neutral. It is a condition imposed by the human mind. It assumes that truth must appear in a form that satisfies our need for certainty. But what if truth refuses to conform to that demand? What if the structure of reality itself requires ambiguity? This ambiguity is not random, it is precise. Enough presence to suggest, enough absence to question, enough clarity to invite, enough obscurity to resist. This balance creates a space where freedom operates. You are not forced to believe. You are not forced to reject. You are placed in a position where both are possible. And in that possibility, your orientation becomes real. The third movement exposes the tragedy within this structure. Because freedom does not guarantee truth, it only guarantees the possibility of choosing. And many choose to turn away. Not because evidence is lacking, but because commitment is costly. Belief is not a simple intellectual act. It is existential. It requires reorientation. It demands that one's life align with what is believed. It transforms priorities, actions, identity. And this transformation is not comfortable. So the mind resists. It searches for certainty, not to find truth, but to avoid commitment. It demands proof, not to believe, but to justify disbelief. It hides behind doubt as a shield against the consequences of belief. Another question emerges, sharper than before. Do you seek truth, or do you seek protection from what truth would require? This question reveals the psychological depth of the problem. Because disbelief is not always about evidence, it is often about avoidance. Avoidance of responsibility, of transformation, of surrender. Pascal does not accuse directly. He exposes the structure that allows this avoidance to operate. Hiddenness creates space. Freedom fills that space. And within that freedom, the human being reveals itself. The modern world intensifies this dynamic. In 2025, ambiguity is often treated as weakness. Clarity is demanded in all domains. Immediate answers, visible results, measurable outcomes. This expectation extends even to the question of the divine. If something cannot be proven, it is dismissed. But this dismissal carries an assumption that truth must be accessible in the same way as empirical facts, that what cannot be measured cannot be real. Pascal challenges this assumption at its core. He reveals that the most important dimensions of existence do not operate under this logic. Love cannot be proven mathematically. Meaning cannot be demonstrated experimentally. Trust cannot be reduced to data. Yet these are central to human life. Why then should the highest question conform to a lower standard? The hiddenness of God exposes this inconsistency. It forces the recognition that not all truth is given in the same way. Some must be approached differently, not through domination, but through openness. This introduces a fourth movement, the role of sincerity. Hiddenness does not mean that truth is inaccessible. It means that access is conditioned, not by intelligence alone, but by orientation, by the state of the one who seeks. Pascal suggests that the divine reveals itself not to those who demand, but to those who are willing to see, not in the sense of passive acceptance, but in the sense of honest engagement. This creates a division, not between the intelligent and the ignorant, but between the sincere and the evasive. The sincere individual approaches the question without precondition. They are willing to confront uncertainty, willing to accept that truth may not appear in the form they expect, willing to be transformed if it is found. The evasive individual approaches with hidden resistance. They demand certainty as a barrier. They use doubt as a defense. They remain protected from commitment. Through this distinction, the tragedy becomes clear. Because hiddenness does not force rejection, it allows it. Consider the figure of the restless skeptic, always questioning, always demanding proof, never committing. This person appears intellectually rigorous, but beneath this rigor, something else may operate. A refusal to risk belief, a fear of transformation. Through this figure, we see that doubt can become a refuge. Now consider the figure of the blind believer, committed without question, certain without reflection. This person appears stable, but without confrontation, belief becomes shallow. It lacks depth because it has never faced uncertainty. Through this figure, we see that belief without tension is incomplete. Pascal refuses both extremes. He does not accept blind certainty. He does not accept endless doubt. He places the human being in the tension between them. This tension is the condition of authentic belief. It is not resolved by eliminating doubt. It is not resolved by achieving absolute certainty. It is lived within. It requires movement, engagement, struggle. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. The hiddenness of God is not a problem to solve. It is a condition to face. It creates the space where freedom, sincerity, and commitment intersect. You are not given complete clarity. You are not left in complete darkness. You are placed in between. And in that space, your response defines you. Will you demand certainty and remain distant? Will you accept blindly and avoid confrontation? Or will you stand within the ambiguity, neither escaping nor collapsing, and allow the question to shape your existence? There is no neutral answer, because even silence becomes a response. And at that point, the tragedy reveals itself fully. Not that God is hidden, but that in the presence of that hiddenness, the human being chooses whether to seek or to turn away, and cannot pretend that the choice was never made. Chapter 8: The Hidden Architecture of Belief Beyond Reason. Human beings do not believe because something is proven. They believe because something has already taken root within them. Logic does not create belief. It justifies it after the fact. What we call conviction is often not the result of reasoning, but the result of formation, repetition, and silent influence. Long before modern psychology uncovered cognitive bias and behavioral conditioning, Blaise Pascal had already exposed a deeper mechanism. When the world believed that truth persuades through argument alone, he saw something more unsettling. He saw that belief is lived before it is understood, that the mind often follows where habit has already led. The first movement must be faced without illusion. Human beings do not arrive at belief as neutral observers. They are shaped long before they begin to question. Family, culture, environment, repetition. These forces operate quietly, embedding assumptions before reflection even begins. By the time a person asks what they believe, much of the answer has already been decided. This does not mean belief is false. It means belief is conditioned. We like to imagine that we evaluate ideas objectively, weighing evidence, considering arguments, arriving at conclusions through reason. But this is rarely the full picture. More often, we accept what feels familiar, what aligns with our environment, what fits our internal needs, and then we construct reasons to defend it. A question cuts sharply through this illusion. Do you believe something because it is true, or because it has become part of how you live? The second movement deepens the structure. Habit is one of the most powerful forces in shaping belief. Not dramatic events, not singular decisions, but repeated actions. What you do consistently becomes what you accept. What you practice becomes what you perceive as normal. Pascal reveals that belief is not only an intellectual state, it is embodied, it is enacted, it is reinforced through behavior. This creates a reversal of common thinking. We assume that belief leads to action, but often action leads to belief. You begin by doing something, repeating it, living within it, and over time it becomes natural, familiar, true, not because it has been proven, but because it has been lived. This is why changing belief is so difficult. Not because arguments are insufficient, but because behavior remains unchanged. The structure that sustains the belief is still in place. You cannot think your way out of a belief that is reinforced by how you live. The third movement exposes another layer. Emotion plays a central role. Human beings are not purely rational. They are driven by desire, fear, comfort, attachment. Beliefs align with these forces. We believe what allows us to feel stable. We believe what protects us from anxiety. We believe what gives us a sense of belonging or purpose. This does not mean belief is irrational. It means it is intertwined with psychological needs. A belief that threatens identity will be resisted, regardless of its logical strength. A belief that provides comfort will be accepted, even if it lacks strong evidence. Another question emerges, more unsettling than the last. If a belief were true, but required you to change your life completely, would you still accept it? This question reveals the tension between truth and desire. Because belief is not only about what is correct, it is about what can be lived. The modern world intensifies this mechanism to an extreme. In 2025, environments are no longer passive. They are engineered. Algorithms, social systems, constant feedback loops shape perception continuously. People are surrounded by information that reinforces what they already lean toward. This creates echo chambers of belief, not through force, but through repetition. The same ideas appear again and again until they feel obvious, natural, undeniable. Not because they have been critically examined, but because they have been constantly present. Pascal's insight becomes sharper here. Belief is not formed in isolation. It is cultivated through context. Change the environment, and belief begins to shift. This leads to a deeper realization. If you want to understand what someone believes, do not only listen to what they say. Observe how they live. Observe what they repeat. Observe what they expose themselves to. Because belief is not only declared, it is practiced. The fourth movement pushes further into the existential core. Many beliefs are adopted before they are understood. People live within frameworks they have never examined. They inherit assumptions, values, orientations, and only later attempt to justify them. This creates a strange inversion. Understanding follows commitment. You believe first, then you seek reasons. This is not necessarily wrong, it is unavoidable, but it becomes dangerous when it remains unconscious. When individuals believe they are neutral, objective, independent, while being deeply shaped by forces they do not recognize. Pascal demands awareness of this process, not to eliminate it, but to expose it. Because once exposed, belief becomes a conscious structure rather than an inherited one. Consider the figure of the convinced thinker, articulate, logical, able to defend their position with precision. This person appears grounded in reason, but beneath the arguments lies a history, a formation, a pattern of exposure and reinforcement. Through this figure, we see that reasoning often stabilizes belief rather than creates it. Now consider the figure of the one who changes belief. This is not usually triggered by a single argument. It is triggered by a shift in life, a new environment, a different pattern of action, a disruption of habit. Through this figure, we see that transformation begins not only in thought, but in lived experience. Pascal's insight becomes unavoidable. If you want to change what you believe, you must change how you live. Not as a superficial adjustment, but as a structural shift. New actions, new contexts, new repetitions. Over time, these reshape perception, and with it, belief. This is why intellectual debate alone rarely transforms deeply held convictions. It addresses the surface, not the foundation. The foundation lies in habit, emotion, environment. To reach that level requires more than argument. It requires reorientation. The synthesis becomes clear. Human beings believe through a complex interplay of reason, habit, emotion, and context. To reduce belief to logic alone is to misunderstand its structure. To ignore logic entirely is to lose direction. The challenge is not to eliminate these forces, but to become aware of them, to see how belief is formed, to recognize the influences that shape it, to question not only what you believe, but how you came to believe it. This awareness does not guarantee truth, but it removes illusion. Because once you see that belief is lived before it is understood, you can no longer pretend that your convictions are purely the result of reason. And at that point, something shifts. Belief is no longer something you passively hold. It becomes something you are actively responsible for. And in that realization, the comfort of certainty begins to break. because you see that what you believe is not only a conclusion, it is a structure you are continuously building with every action you repeat. Chapter 9: Justice, Custom, and the Fragile Architecture of Social Order. What we call justice is often nothing more than habit, repeated until it becomes unquestioned. It does not begin as truth. It begins as practice. And over time, practice hardens into law, and law disguises itself as morality. Long before modern political theory attempted to define fairness and rights, Blaise Pascal had already exposed a more unsettling foundation. When societies believed their laws reflected universal justice, he saw something more fragile. He saw that what is accepted as just in one place is rejected in another, that what is sacred in one time becomes absurd in another. And yet, within each context, it feels absolute. The first movement must be faced without illusion. Justice, as lived in society, is rarely pure. It is shaped by custom, by repetition, by collective agreement that has lost its origin. People follow rules not because they have examined their truth, but because they have inherited their authority. This creates stability, but it also creates blindness. Custom operates silently. It does not argue. It does not justify itself. It simply continues. And through its continuity, it gains power. The longer something is practiced, the more natural it appears. The more natural it appears, the less it is questioned. A question cuts through this structure with force. If you had been born into a different society, would your sense of justice be the same? The answer destabilizes certainty, because much of what we consider right or wrong is not derived from universal reasoning, but from local conditioning. We absorb norms before we reflect on them. We internalize rules before we evaluate them. This does not mean all justice is arbitrary. It means that our access to it is mediated through custom. The second movement deepens the tension. Law requires authority. It must be enforced to function. But authority does not always align with truth. Power sustains order, but it can also sustain injustice. Pascal reveals a dangerous paradox. If justice were perfectly clear, it would not need force. People would recognize it and follow it naturally. But because justice is often unclear, force becomes necessary to maintain order. This creates a substitution. What cannot be justified is imposed. Over time, this imposition becomes normalized. People obey not because they see truth, but because they accept structure. And through this acceptance, structure becomes indistinguishable from truth. This is where confusion reaches its peak, because once custom and authority merge, questioning becomes difficult. To challenge the system is to challenge stability itself, and stability is something most people are unwilling to risk. Another question emerges, sharper than before. Are you obeying because something is just, or because it has always been this way? The third movement exposes the psychological dimension. Human beings need order. Without it, existence becomes chaotic. Rules provide predictability. Structure provides security. Even imperfect systems are often preferred to uncertainty. This creates a compromise. People tolerate injustice to preserve stability, not because they are unaware, but because the cost of disruption feels too high. They adapt, they rationalize, they adjust their perception to fit the system they live within. Over time, this adaptation becomes internalized. What was once imposed becomes accepted. What was once questioned becomes assumed. This is how injustice survives, not only through power, but through habit. The modern world intensifies this dynamic in subtle ways. In 2025, systems are more complex, more abstract, more distant from individual perception. Laws, institutions, regulations operate at scales that individuals cannot fully grasp. This creates a gap. People follow rules they do not fully understand. They accept structures they did not create. They participate in systems whose consequences extend beyond their awareness. And within this complexity, custom becomes even more powerful. Because questioning requires effort, knowledge, risk, and most choose convenience. Pascal's insight becomes sharper here. Justice in practice is not sustained by truth alone. It is sustained by belief in its legitimacy. And that belief is often inherited, not examined. This leads to a deeper realization. Social order is fragile, not because it lacks structure, but because its foundation is not as solid as it appears. It depends on collective acceptance, on shared assumptions, on the continuation of custom. Remove these, and the system begins to crack. But this fragility is rarely acknowledged, because to acknowledge it would introduce uncertainty. It would force individuals to question the very ground they stand on. Consider the figure of the obedient citizen, law-abiding, respectful of authority, aligned with social norms. This person appears stable, integrated, functional. But beneath this alignment, something else may operate. An unexamined acceptance, a reliance on inherited structures. Through this figure, we see the comfort of conformity. Now consider the figure of the radical reformer, questioning, challenging, refusing to accept established norms. This person appears disruptive, unstable, dangerous. But within this disruption lies another force, the attempt to realign structure with truth. Through this figure, we see the tension between order and justice. Pascal does not romanticize either side. He does not call for blind obedience. He does not call for total rejection. He recognizes the necessity of custom for stability and the necessity of questioning for truth. This creates a difficult position, because to preserve order completely is to risk preserving injustice, and to reject order completely is to risk chaos. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. Human societies exist in a constant tension between stability and correction. Custom provides continuity. Reflection provides adjustment. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. Wisdom lies not in destroying tradition, nor in blindly preserving it. It lies in discerning what within tradition still carries life, and what has become empty repetition. This discernment is rare, because it requires both courage and restraint. Courage to question, restraint to not destroy indiscriminately, clarity to see beyond habit, humility to recognize limits. Most people avoid this complexity. They choose one side, either complete acceptance or complete rejection. Both simplify reality. Both avoid the tension. But the tension does not disappear, because justice is not static. It cannot be fixed once and for all. It must be continuously examined, continuously corrected, continuously regrounded. And this process is never complete. Another question cuts deeper than all before. If the system you live in were unjust, would you recognize it, or would you adapt to it? This question reveals the final layer, because recognition is not guaranteed. Adaptation is easier, safer, more comfortable. And so injustice can persist not because it is hidden, but because it is normalized. Pascal forces the confrontation. He strips away the illusion that society rests on pure justice. He reveals that it rests on a mixture of custom, power, belief, and partial truth. To see this clearly is destabilizing, because it removes certainty. It exposes fragility. It demands responsibility. You can no longer assume that what is established is what is right. You can no longer hide behind the continuity of tradition. You can no longer separate yourself from the structure you participate in. Because you are part of it, and in that realization, something shifts irreversibly. Justice is no longer something guaranteed by the system. It becomes something that demands your awareness, your judgment, and your willingness to confront what others have accepted without question. And at that point, the comfort of order begins to crack. Because you see that what holds society together is not truth alone, but the fragile agreement to continue believing in it. Chapter 10: Happiness, Love, and the Transformation of Human Desire. Human beings do not fail to find happiness because it does not exist. They fail because they search for it in places that can never contain it. The error is not in the desire itself. The error is in its direction. We do not desire too much. We desire wrongly. Long before modern culture turned happiness into a product, a goal, a measurable outcome, Blaise Pascal had already exposed the deeper tragedy. When people believed that fulfillment could be achieved through accumulation, pleasure, or success, he saw something more unsettling. He saw that the human heart is structured for something it cannot fully name, and in that confusion, it attaches itself to what cannot satisfy it. The first movement must be faced without illusion. Every human being seeks happiness. This is not a choice. It is a condition. Every action, every decision, every pursuit is oriented towards some form of perceived fulfillment. Even suffering is sometimes chosen because it is believed to lead to something better. But this universal pursuit hides a critical flaw. We assume that happiness is located outside us, in objects, achievements, relationships, recognition. And so we move toward these things with intensity, believing that once obtained, they will resolve the inner tension we carry. They do not. Not because they are meaningless, but because they are insufficient. They can satisfy temporarily, partially, conditionally, but they cannot complete the structure of desire that drives us. This leads to a sharp question. If everything you pursue eventually loses its power to satisfy, what exactly are you trying to reach? The second movement deepens the contradiction. Human desire is not static. It expands. What satisfies today becomes insufficient tomorrow. What once felt meaningful becomes ordinary. This is not a flaw in the world. It is a feature of the human condition. Desire moves beyond what it attains. This creates a cycle: pursuit, attainment, temporary satisfaction, decline, renewed pursuit, over and over. The object changes, the structure remains. Pascal reveals that this cycle is not accidental. It reflects a deeper mismatch. The human being desires something absolute, but engages with things that are finite. No finite object can absorb infinite desire. This is why fulfillment always escapes. We blame the object. We seek a better one, a more complete one, a more perfect one. But the problem is not the object. It is the expectation placed upon it. Another question emerges, more unsettling than the last. Are you dissatisfied because you have not found the right thing, or because nothing can be enough? The third movement exposes the nature of love within this structure. Love is often presented as the highest form of human fulfillment, and in many ways it is. But even love becomes distorted when it is used to fill the void that no human relationship can fully resolve. We expect from others what they cannot provide: absolute understanding, permanent presence, complete alignment. We turn love into a demand for completion. This transforms love into pressure. Instead of a movement beyond the self, it becomes an extension of the self's need. We do not love the other as they are. We love them as a solution to our lack. And when they fail to fulfill this role, disappointment follows. Not because they are inadequate, but because the expectation was impossible. Pascal sees this distortion clearly. He does not reject love, he redefines its place. Love is not the fulfillment of desire, it is the transformation of desire. This introduces a fourth movement. Transformation does not begin with external change. It begins with a shift in what is desired. As long as desire is directed toward finite objects as if they were ultimate, dissatisfaction remains inevitable. The problem is not desire itself. The problem is its orientation. To transform desire is not to suppress it, but to redirect it. To recognize that what we seek cannot be fully contained within what we chase. To stop demanding from the world what the world cannot give. This does not eliminate happiness, it redefines it. Happiness is no longer the result of acquisition. It becomes the result of alignment, not between self and object, but between desire and reality. The modern world intensifies the confusion around this. In 2025, happiness is marketed, optimized, engineered. It is presented as something attainable through the right choices, the right habits, the right conditions. This creates a powerful illusion that if you fail to be happy, you have made a mistake. But Pascal's insight dismantles this illusion. The problem is not personal failure. It is structural misunderstanding. The system promises fulfillment through what cannot fulfill, and so individuals remain in constant pursuit, believing that the next step will resolve what the previous did not. It does not, because the structure has not changed. The fifth movement pushes into the existential core. Transformation requires a confrontation with the limits of the self. The self desires to possess, to control, to complete itself through external means, To move beyond this requires a shift that the self resists. It requires letting go of the illusion of self-sufficiency. This is where Pascal introduces the idea of grace, not as a theological abstraction, but as a recognition that transformation is not fully produced by effort alone. There is a dimension of change that cannot be forced. It must be received. This is difficult to accept because it removes control. It places the individual in a position of openness rather than dominance. It requires humility rather than assertion. Most resist this. They continue to rely on effort, on strategy, on optimization. They attempt to engineer fulfillment. But what they seek cannot be engineered completely. Consider the figure of the successful individual, achieved, recognized, accomplished. This person has obtained what many desire, and yet something remains unresolved. A subtle dissatisfaction, a sense that something is still missing. Through this figure, we see that success does not eliminate the deeper tension. Now, consider the figure of the one who shifts internally. Not necessarily more successful, not necessarily more recognized, but oriented differently. Less driven by acquisition, more aware of limitation, less dependent on external validation. Through this figure, we see a different kind of movement, not outward expansion, but inward transformation. Pascal does not romanticize this transformation. It is not comfortable. It requires the collapse of illusions. It demands the recognition that what we have pursued cannot fully satisfy us. It forces a reevaluation of desire itself. The synthesis becomes unavoidable. Human beings are driven by a desire that exceeds the world. This desire cannot be eliminated. It cannot be fully satisfied by finite means. It can only be transformed. Happiness, then, is not the completion of desire. It is the reorientation of desire. Love, then, is not possession. It is the movement beyond the self. Transformation, then, is not accumulation. It is surrender. These are not comforting conclusions. They remove the illusion of easy fulfillment. They expose the limits of what we can achieve through effort alone. They confront us with the reality that what we seek may require a different kind of response entirely. Most will resist this. They will continue to pursue, to accumulate, to expect satisfaction from what has never satisfied them before. Not because they are unaware, but because the alternative demands too much. It demands letting go of control. It demands accepting limits. It demands facing the possibility that fulfillment is not where we have been looking. But for those who do not turn away, something irreversible happens. The cycle begins to break. Not because desire disappears, but because it is no longer misdirected. And in that moment, the search changes completely. Because you are no longer trying to fill yourself with what cannot hold you. You are confronting the truth that what you seek was never something you could possess. And that is where everything you thought happiness was begins to collapse. Human beings do not need comforting truths. They need necessary ones. And the philosophy of Blaise Pascal delivers exactly that. It does not soothe, it exposes. It does not resolve tension, it sharpens it until it can no longer be ignored. Across every layer of existence, from misery to distraction, from reason to belief, from the self to society, one structure remains constant. The human being is divided, restless, unfinished. Pascal does not offer escape from this condition. He reveals it in full. He forces us to confront the instability we spend our lives trying to hide, the illusions we build around identity, the distractions we use to avoid silence, the beliefs we inherit without awareness, the systems we obey without question. All of it is stripped down to a single demand: to see clearly. And in that clarity, something irreversible happens. We recognize that our suffering is not accidental, but structural, that our search for happiness has been misdirected, that our certainty is often constructed, that our neutrality is an illusion, that our beliefs are lived before they are understood, that our sense of justice is shaped before it is questioned, that even our idea of truth is limited by the way we seek it. This recognition does not comfort, it destabilizes. But within that destabilization, another possibility emerges. Not a solution, but a shift. A movement away from illusion and toward confrontation. Not to eliminate contradiction, but to live within it without denial. Not to control existence, but to face it without distortion. Pascal's philosophy does not end in answers. It ends in a question that cannot be avoided. What are you truly living for, beneath everything you claim to pursue? This question does not disappear once asked. It follows. It presses. It exposes every action, every choice, every belief. It removes the possibility of unconscious living, because once you see the structure, you cannot return to blindness without knowing that you are choosing it. And that is where everything changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because illusion becomes harder to maintain. Not because certainty is achieved, but because false certainty collapses. Not because suffering ends, but because its meaning becomes unavoidable. And in that moment, you are no longer protected by distraction, identity, or inherited belief. You are standing directly before the truth of your own existence, with nothing left to hide behind. And that is where the real question of life finally begins.